At my girlfriend's birthday brunch, her sister joked, "If you broke up with her, everyone would thank you." I smiled and said, "Done." I ended things that afternoon, and her entire family started calling me. The silence at the table was absolute. I just set down my mimosa glass, the clink against the white tablecloth impossibly loud in the sudden quiet, and every person at that brunch table was staring at me like I'd pulled a gun, instead of simply agreeing with what Chloe's sister had said. Vanessa's mouth was hanging open, her perfectly manicured hand frozen halfway to her face. Chloe's mother had gone pale, her fork suspended over her eggs Benedict. And Chloe herself, sitting at the head of the table in her birthday crown that she'd insisted everyone wear matching ones to compliment, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but something closer to panic mixed with disbelief. "Did you just?" she started, her voice tight and controlled in that way that meant she was about to lose it completely. "Did you just break up with me at my birthday brunch because Vanessa made a joke?" I looked at her, at the designer dress I'd bought her last week, at the Cartier bracelet she'd demanded for her birthday that had cost me 3 months of savings, at the entitled expression she wore like a second skin, and I felt something inside me that had been bending for 18 months finally snap clean through. I'd met Chloe 2 years ago at a charity gala my company had sponsored, one of those black tie events where software engineers like me felt perpetually underdressed no matter what we wore. She'd been working the room with practiced ease, beautiful in a way that seemed almost weaponized, making every man feel like the center of her attention for exactly as long as it served her purpose. When she'd approached me, I'd been standing alone by the bar nursing a bourbon and watching the social dynamics with the detached interest of someone who'd never quite fit into these environments. She'd introduced herself as Chloe Beaumont, asked what I did, and when I'd mentioned I was a senior developer at a fintech startup, her interest had intensified in a way I'd found flattering at the time. We'd talked for an hour about everything and nothing, and when she'd given me her number, I'd felt like I'd won something. The first 3 months had been intoxicating. Chloe was exciting, spontaneous, the kind of person who made life feel like an adventure. She'd take me to exclusive restaurants, introduce me to her wealthy friends, show me a world I'd never accessed on my developer's salary. I'd grown up middle class in Ohio, put myself through college, built a career through hard work rather than connections. Chloe's world of trust funds and family money and social currency was alien but seductive. She'd seemed to find my outsider status charming, had told her friends I was refreshingly authentic and down to earth. Looking back, I could see the red flags I'd missed, could trace the pattern of manipulation that had started almost immediately. But at the time, I'd been too dazzled to notice. The first real warning sign had been how quickly she'd wanted to move in together. We'd been dating for 4 months when she'd suggested I give up my apartment and move into hers, a luxury 2-bedroom in Tribeca that her parents paid for. "It makes financial sense," she'd said. "Why are you wasting money on rent when you could be here?" I'd hesitated, feeling like 4 months was too soon, but Chloe had made it seem reasonable and practical. She'd pointed out how much I could save, how we were together every night anyway, how it was the obvious next step. I'd given up my lease and moved in, and within weeks I'd started to understand what a mistake I'd made. Living with Chloe meant living by Chloe's rules. She'd wanted access to my phone, said couples should be transparent with each other. She'd asked about my female coworkers, questioned why I needed to have lunch with colleagues when I could come home to her. She'd gradually started making plans for us without asking, canceling my commitments to friends because she'd scheduled something else. When I'd objected, she'd made it seem like I was being unreasonable, like I didn't value our relationship, like I was choosing other people over her. The arguments had a pattern. I'd raise a concern, she'd twist it into an attack on her, I'd end up apologizing and agreeing to whatever she wanted. It was emotional jujitsu, using my own desire to be a good partner against me. The financial control had started subtly. Chloe didn't work, her parents supported her lifestyle, but she'd started expecting me to pay for things. Dinners out, always at expensive places she chose, vacations, trips to resorts I couldn't afford, but she insisted we needed. Designer items she'd see and want, presented not as requests, but as expectations. When I'd tried to discuss budgets, tried to explain that I was a salaried employee, not a trust fund heir, she'd accused me of being cheap, of embarrassing her in front of her friends, of not loving her enough to want her to have nice things. I'd started using credit cards to keep up, had gone from savings to debt in less than a year, all while living rent-free in an apartment I'd never felt at home in. My friends had started noticing the changes. Ben, my college roommate and closest friend, had tried to talk to me about it 6 months in. "Dude," he'd said over beers at our old hangout spot, "you're different. You used to be fun, spontaneous. Now you're always checking your phone to see if Chloe's texted, always worried about what she'll think. It's like you're walking on eggshells." I'd defended her, said Ben didn't understand our relationship, that Chloe just had high standards and wanted us to be our best selves. Ben had backed off, but I'd seen the concern in his eyes. Over the next few months, I'd seen less and less of him, had gradually stopped returning calls from other friends. Chloe had needed me, had been anxious when I went out without her, had made my social life feel like a betrayal. Isolation was easier than conflict. The relationship with Chloe's family had been complicated from the start. Her parents, Richard and Diane Beaumont, were old money Manhattan. The kind of people who summered in the Hamptons and knew everyone who mattered. They'd been polite to me but distant, clearly viewing me as beneath their daughter's station. Her sister Vanessa, 3 years older and married to a hedge fund manager, had been friendlier, but with an undercurrent of condescension. She'd ask about my job like it was a cute hobby, had made comments about how nice it must be for Chloe to date someone so normal. The extended family had treated me like a novelty, the working-class boyfriend Chloe had inexplicably chosen, someone to be polite to but never quite accept. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. But they'd all enabled Chloe's behavior, had normalized her demands and tantrums and manipulation. When she'd thrown a fit at a family dinner because the restaurant didn't have her preferred wine, they'd smoothed it over and ordered something else. When she'd berated a waiter for bringing her food too slowly, they'd left a larger tip, but said nothing about her treatment of service staff. When she'd demanded I leave my company's holiday party early because she was bored, and I'd complied despite it being important for my career, her mother had said approvingly that it was good I prioritized my relationship. They'd created an environment where Chloe's worst impulses were rewarded, where anyone who didn't cater to her was clearly in the wrong. The birthday brunch had been Chloe's idea, a Sunday morning gathering at an upscale restaurant in the West Village that she'd reserved the back room for. She'd planned everything, the menu, the decorations, even the matching birthday crowns everyone was supposed to wear. I'd paid for it all, $3,000 for a brunch for 20 people, money I didn't have but had put on credit because Chloe had said it was important to her. The morning had been typical Chloe, micromanaging every detail, sending back dishes that weren't perfect, treating the staff like servants. Her friends and family had laughed and chatted and pretended not to notice, had thanked me for hosting such a lovely event. Then Vanessa had made her comment. We'd been sitting around the table after the meal, Chloe opening presents, and she'd gotten to mine. I'd bought her the Cartier bracelet she'd been hinting about for weeks, had maxed out my last credit card to afford it. She'd opened the box, barely glanced at it, and said it was nice, but she'd been hoping for the matching earrings too. The table had gone awkwardly quiet. Vanessa, slightly drunk on mimosas, had laughed and said to me, "If you broke up with her, everyone would thank you." She'd said it like a joke, the kind of inappropriate comment you make when you've had too much brunch champagne. But I'd heard the truth underneath it, had seen it confirmed in the expressions of everyone at that table. They all knew what Chloe was. They all knew what she was doing to me. And they'd all been complicit in it, had watched it happen and said nothing because it was easier to let me be destroyed than to confront her. So I'd smiled and said, "Done." Just that one word, delivered with a calm I hadn't felt in months. And the table had erupted, Chloe demanding to know if I was serious, her parents asking what on earth I thought I was doing, Vanessa backtracking and saying she'd been joking. I'd stood up, removed the ridiculous birthday crown I'd been wearing, and said I'd be out of the apartment by the end of the day. Chloe had started to cry, not real tears, but the performative crying she did when she wanted something, asking how I could do this to her on her birthday, in front of everyone. I'd looked at her and felt absolutely nothing, just a vast emptiness where 18 months of suppressed resentment and exhaustion had been festering. I'd left the restaurant and gone directly to the apartment, started packing my things into boxes I'd bought and kept in the storage unit I'd never given up, some part of me always knowing this arrangement was temporary. I didn't have much. Chloe had made me get rid of most of my old furniture when I moved in, said it didn't match her aesthetic. My clothes, my books, my laptop and work equipment, a few personal items. It all fit into 6 boxes and 2 suitcases. I'd loaded everything into my Subaru, which Chloe had always hated because it wasn't nice enough for her, and driven to Ben's place in Brooklyn. He'd opened the door, taken one look at me, and said the guest room was mine for as long as I needed it. The calls had started within an hour. Chloe first, screaming at me, demanding I come back and talk to her like an adult. Then her mother, Diane, ice cold and threatening, saying I'd embarrassed their family and I'd better fix this immediately. Richard called next, trying the reasonable approach, suggesting I was upset and should take some time to cool down before making rash decisions. Vanessa sent a string of texts saying she'd been joking, that I'd overreacted, that I was ruining Chloe's birthday over nothing. I'd blocked them all, every number, felt a weight lift off my shoulders with each person I cut off. Ben had made coffee, and we'd sat in his kitchen while I'd explained the past 18 months, details I'd never shared with anyone. The financial control, the isolation, the constant walking on eggshells, the gradual erosion of everything I'd been before Chloe. Ben had listened without interrupting, his expression getting darker. "Dude," he'd said when I finished, "that's abuse. What you just described is textbook emotional and financial abuse. You need to talk to someone, a therapist, someone who understands this stuff." I'd felt resistance to that label. Abuse seemed like something that happened to other people, something obvious and physical. But Ben had been insistent, had pulled up information on his phone about coercive control and financial abuse, and I'd seen my relationship with Chloe reflected in every description. I'd called my company's employee assistance program the next morning, got a referral to a therapist named Dr. Linda Chambers, who specialized in recovery from abusive relationships. Dr. Chambers had 26 years of experience and a direct, no-nonsense approach that I'd appreciated immediately. She'd listened to my story and then laid out exactly what had happened to me. Chloe had used classic tactics, she'd explained. Love bombing in the beginning to establish dependency, then gradual isolation from support systems, financial control to create vulnerability, gaslighting to make you doubt your own perceptions. The fact that you don't think of it as abuse is part of how abuse works. Abusers create a reality where their behavior seems normal, even loving, where questioning it makes you the bad guy. The harassment had escalated over the following week. Chloe had found ways around my blocks, calling from different numbers, sending emails, showing up at my office building. She'd alternated between begging me to come back and threatening me with consequences. She'd told me she'd been pregnant and had miscarried from the stress I'd caused, a claim I'd known was false because we hadn't had sex in 3 months. She'd said she'd harm herself if I didn't talk to her, had sent me photos of pills and alcohol and tearful selfies. Dr. Chambers had advised me to document everything but not respond, had explained that any engagement would reward the behavior and encourage it to continue. I'd gone to the police after Chloe had shown up at Ben's apartment, somehow having found out where I was staying. The responding officers had been sympathetic, but limited in what they could do. Officer David Riley, a veteran cop with 15 years on the force, had taken my statement and the documentation I'd compiled. "This is clearly harassment," he'd said, "but getting a restraining order can be tough in these situations. She hasn't explicitly threatened violence. The pregnancy and self-harm stuff is manipulation, but it's hard to prove. Keep documenting everything. If she continues, we can build a stronger case." He'd filed a report and suggested I consult with an attorney about a civil harassment order. The attorney I'd consulted, Margaret Finley, who specialized in family law and harassment cases, had reviewed everything and given me a sobering assessment. "You have a strong case for a restraining order based on the pattern of harassment," she'd said. "But I need to warn you, people like Chloe don't respond well to legal boundaries. Often it escalates before it gets better. We can pursue this, but you need to be prepared for her to get worse, not better." I'd authorized her to file the paperwork, had appeared before a judge who'd granted a temporary restraining order pending a hearing. Chloe had been served at her parents' apartment, and according to Finley, had lost her mind when the papers were delivered. That's when Chloe's family had shifted tactics. I'd received a letter from their attorney, a partner at a white shoe Manhattan firm named Preston Hayworth, threatening to sue me for defamation and emotional distress. The letter had claimed I'd made false allegations about Chloe, had damaged her reputation, had caused her severe psychological harm. It had demanded I drop the restraining order and issue a public apology, or face litigation. Margaret Finley had laughed when I'd shown her the letter. "This is intimidation, nothing more," she'd said. "They have no case. You can't be sued for seeking a restraining order, and everything you've documented is true. This is rich people trying to bully you into backing down. Don't engage." But the pressure had been relentless. Richard Beaumont had called my boss, claimed I'd been harassing his daughter, suggested the company should be concerned about my behavior. My manager, a level-headed woman named Jennifer Knox, who'd worked with me for 3 years, had called me in and asked directly what was going on. I'd explained the situation, shown her the restraining order paperwork, and the documentation of Chloe's harassment. Jennifer had been supportive, had said the company stood behind me, had told Richard Beaumont that personnel matters were confidential and he should stop calling. But I'd felt the professional impact, the way colleagues had looked at me differently, whispered when I walked by, turned drama into gossip. Chloe had started a social media campaign, posting vague messages about heartbreak and betrayal and abusive partners who gaslight their victims. She'd never named me directly, but everyone who followed both of us knew exactly who she was talking about. Her friends had joined in, posting supportive comments and sharing her posts, creating a narrative where I was the villain and she was the victim. I'd watched my reputation get destroyed in real time, people I'd considered friends believing her version without asking for mine. Ben had wanted to respond, to post the truth, but Dr. Chambers and Margaret Finley had both advised against engaging. "Let her tell her story," they'd said. "The truth will come out." The financial disentanglement had been complicated. I'd gone through my credit card statements and calculated that I'd spent over $75,000 on Chloe over 18 months. Dinners, vacations, gifts, the birthday brunch, money I didn't have, debt I'd taken on to meet her expectations. A financial advisor named Robert Chang, who specialized in debt recovery, had helped me create a plan. "You can't get that money back," he'd said bluntly. "There's no legal mechanism to recover gifts or shared expenses from an ex-partner unless you can prove fraud, which is a high bar. Your focus needs to be on debt consolidation and rebuilding. It'll take time, but you can recover from this." The number had been staggering, the realization that I'd destroyed my financial health for someone who'd seen me as a wallet with a pulse. The restraining order hearing had been scheduled for 3 weeks after the temporary order was issued. I'd appeared with Margaret Finley, bringing the documentation we'd compiled. Texts showing Chloe's harassment, emails with threats and manipulation, photos of her appearing at places I'd been despite the temporary order, testimony from Ben about the relationship dynamics he'd witnessed, the statement from Dr. Chambers about the psychological impact of the abuse. Chloe had appeared with Preston Hayworth and her parents, dressed conservatively, the picture of a heartbroken victim rather than a harasser. She'd testified that I'd broken her heart and abandoned her, that she'd only been trying to get closure, that the restraining order was my way of avoiding accountability for hurting her. Judge Rebecca Morrison, a family court judge with 22 years on the bench, had listened to both sides with professional neutrality. Then she'd started asking Chloe questions. Why had she contacted Mr. Garrett from multiple phone numbers after being blocked? Why had she appeared at his workplace despite being told to stay away? Why had she claimed to be pregnant when medical records showed no evidence of pregnancy or miscarriage? Chloe had stammered through answers that didn't hold up under scrutiny. Judge Morrison had granted the permanent restraining order, valid for 3 years. Mr. Garrett has demonstrated a clear pattern of harassment, she'd said to Chloe. You will have no contact with him directly or indirectly. No phone calls, no emails, no social media contact, no appearing at his home or workplace. Violation will result in criminal charges. Do you understand? Chloe had nodded, her face red with humiliation. But the order hadn't stopped the Beaumont family's campaign. They'd shifted to attacking my character through other means. Richard had connections in my industry, had started spreading rumors that I was unstable, unreliable, a bad hire. I'd been contacted by a recruiter about a position I'd applied for months ago, told confidentially that there were concerns about my professionalism based on reference checks. When I'd asked what references, the recruiter had said she couldn't disclose, but suggested I might want to address whatever situation was creating negative feedback. I'd realized the Beaumonts were sabotaging my career, using their social capital to destroy my professional reputation. Margaret Finley had advised me that we could pursue a defamation claim, but it would be expensive and difficult to prove. You'd need to show specific false statements made to specific people that caused measurable harm, she'd said. That's a high evidentiary bar, and the Beaumonts have resources to drag this out for years. Sometimes the best response to people like this is to simply outlast them. They're used to getting their way through money and connections. When that doesn't work, they eventually move on. It had felt deeply unfair that wealthy people could harass and defame with impunity while I had to just endure it and hope they'd get bored. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Vanessa, Chloe's sister, had reached out to me 6 weeks after the restraining order hearing. She'd asked to meet for coffee, said she needed to talk to me without her family knowing. I'd been suspicious, had brought Ben with me for safety, had recorded the conversation on my phone with Vanessa's knowledge. What she'd told me had recontextualized everything. Chloe had done this before, Vanessa had said. There had been 2 other guys, both with similar stories. One had been a doctor, the other a lawyer. Both had been isolated, financially drained, and emotionally destroyed. One had attempted suicide after Chloe's campaign against him. The family had covered it up, had paid people off, had used their connections to make the problems disappear. Vanessa had brought documentation, emails between family members discussing how to handle Chloe's behavior, financial records showing payments to the previous boyfriends in exchange for non-disclosure agreements, medical records from Chloe's stay at a psychiatric facility 5 years ago, where she'd been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. Her parents had pulled her out after 3 weeks, claimed the doctors didn't know what they were talking about, had enabled her behavior ever since. I'm telling you this because I'm tired of being complicit, Vanessa had said. That comment I made at the brunch, it wasn't really a joke. We've all watched her destroy people and we've done nothing. I can't do that anymore. What she's doing to you, what my parents are doing to help her, it's wrong. I need to do something right. I'd taken the information to Margaret Finley, who'd reviewed it with growing interest. This changes things significantly, she'd said. This establishes a pattern of behavior, shows the family's knowledge and complicity. We can use this to pursue a civil case for intentional infliction of emotional distress and potentially fraud if we can show Chloe misrepresented herself with intent to cause you harm. More immediately, we can use this to shut down their harassment campaign. I'll send a letter to Preston Hayworth with copies of these documents, make it clear that if they continue to defame you, we'll file suit, and this will all become public record. The threat of exposure had been powerful. The Beaumonts prided themselves on their social reputation, couldn't afford a scandal that revealed they'd been covering up their daughter's pattern of abuse. The harassment had stopped within a week of Margaret sending that letter. No more calls from unknown numbers, no more professional sabotage, no more social media posts. Chloe's narrative online had shifted, becoming less specific, moving on to other topics. The Beaumonts had retreated, protecting their reputation over supporting their daughter's vendetta. Preston Hayworth had sent a brief response acknowledging receipt of the documents and stating that his clients would respect the restraining order and cease any commentary about me. It had felt like a victory, but hollow, knowing they faced no real consequences beyond being forced to stop their campaign. Dr. Chambers had helped me process the rage I'd felt about the injustice of it all. It's normal to feel angry, she'd said. You were victimized and then re-victimized by their attempts to protect their daughter and their reputation. But holding on to that anger will only hurt you. They didn't get what they wanted, which was to force you back into compliance or destroy you completely. You got free and stayed free. That's your victory. Focus on rebuilding, not on revenge. It had been good advice, but hard to follow. I'd wanted them to face real consequences, wanted Chloe to be held accountable, wanted her parents to acknowledge what they'd enabled. But the reality was that wealthy people often avoided accountability, insulated by money and connections and the unwillingness of systems to challenge them. The debt consolidation had taken months, but Robert Chang had helped me create a manageable plan. I'd cut up the credit cards, created a strict budget, picked up consulting work on weekends to earn extra income. The $75,000 would take years to pay off, but at least I had a path forward. I'd moved out of Ben's guest room into a studio apartment in Queens, small and cheap, but mine. I'd started reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with during the Chloe years, had been honest about what I'd gone through, had been surprised by how supportive people were. The ones who'd believed Chloe's social media narrative had fallen away, but the real friends had remained. I'd started dating again after 6 months, cautiously, with Dr. Chambers' guidance about healthy relationship dynamics. I'd met someone named Alexis through friends, a teacher who was kind and emotionally stable, and had no interest in expensive restaurants or designer items. We'd taken it slow, built trust gradually, and I'd been hypervigilant about red flags. But Alexis had been patient with my damage, had understood that I needed time to trust again, had shown through consistent behavior that she was safe. It had felt like learning to breathe properly after 18 months of holding my breath. A year after the brunch, I'd received an email from Vanessa. Chloe had gotten engaged to another man, someone else with money and low self-esteem she could exploit. Vanessa had tried to warn him, had shown him the documentation of Chloe's past behavior, but he hadn't believed her. He'd thought Vanessa was jealous or bitter, had chosen to believe Chloe's version where she was the victim of terrible men who'd mistreated her. "I can't save everyone from her," Vanessa had written. "But at least I tried. I'm moving to California, getting distance from this family. I wish I'd spoken up sooner, when you were going through it. I'm sorry I didn't." The apology had meant something, acknowledgement that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated what had happened. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. I'd learned that the doctor Vanessa had mentioned, one of Chloe's previous victims, had successfully sued the Beaumont family after my case gave him courage to challenge the non-disclosure agreement. He'd argued it was signed under duress and was unenforceable given the circumstances. The case had been settled quietly, but word had gotten around in certain circles. The Beaumonts' reputation had taken a hit, not enough to destroy them, but enough to tarnish the perfect image they'd maintained. Chloe's engagement had been called off after 6 months, the fiancé finally seeing through her when she'd escalated her controlling behavior too quickly. The pattern continued, would likely continue as long as her family enabled it, and she faced no real consequences. Dr. Chambers had told me during one of our final sessions that she was proud of how far I'd come. "You walked away from an abusive situation when many people don't," she'd said. "You stood up for yourself legally despite intimidation from powerful people. You rebuilt your life and learned to trust again. That takes remarkable strength and self-awareness. Most importantly, you didn't let them convince you that you were the problem. You held on to the truth even when it would have been easier to doubt yourself. That's the skill that will protect you going forward." I'd graduated from therapy, feeling like I'd earned a degree in recognizing and escaping manipulation. The financial recovery had been slower, but steady. 3 years after leaving Chloe, I'd paid off the debt, rebuilt my savings, been promoted twice at work. The professional reputation the Beaumonts had tried to destroy had recovered as people saw my actual work and character rather than their false narrative. I'd bought a small house in New Jersey, nothing fancy but mine, built equity rather than paying someone else's rent. The material possessions I'd lost by walking away from Chloe's apartment had been replaced with things I'd chosen myself, items that reflected who I actually was rather than who she'd wanted me to be. Alexis and I had gotten engaged, a real partnership built on mutual respect and support rather than control and manipulation. We'd had conversations about finances, about boundaries, about what we both needed to feel safe and valued. She'd never asked me to change who I was or distance myself from my friends. She'd never spent my money without asking or made me feel guilty for having limits. The relationship had been easy in ways I hadn't known relationships could be, proof that what I'd had with Chloe wasn't love, but a gradual destruction wrapped in romance. I'd thought about that brunch often, the moment Vanessa had said everyone would thank me if I broke up with Chloe. The shocked silence when I'd taken her seriously, when I'd called what everyone knew was true, but no one would say. The panic on Chloe's face when she'd realized I meant it, that her control had finally broken, that I was choosing myself over her for the first time in 18 months. Done. Just one word that had changed everything, that had been both an ending and a beginning. They'd all called me after, the family that had enabled and benefited from Chloe's abuse, desperate to put things back the way they were because my compliance had been more comfortable than my freedom. But I'd stayed done, stayed firm in that decision, even when they'd harassed and threatened and tried to destroy me, stayed committed to my own well-being even when it would have been easier to go back, to accept the life Chloe had designed for me, to disappear into her narrative and lose myself completely. The calls from her family had been attempts to restore their equilibrium, to fix the problem I'd created by refusing to be destroyed quietly. But I'd answered none of them, had let every call go to voicemail, had blocked every number until the silence had become permanent. The best revenge hadn't been making them pay or face consequences they'd ultimately avoided. The best revenge had been building a life they couldn't touch, becoming someone who no longer fit into the victim role they'd needed me to play. I'd recovered what they'd taken, not the money, but the sense of self, the relationships, the future I'd been trading away for Chloe's approval. And I'd learned the most important lesson. When someone tells you who they are through their actions, believe them the first time. Don't wait for the sister to make a joke at a birthday brunch. Don't wait for the family to show you they've always known and chosen complicity. Trust your instincts when they tell you something is wrong, and have the courage to say done and mean it. Vanessa's joke hadn't been a joke at all. It had been the truth spoken by someone who'd watched too many people get destroyed and had finally felt drunk enough to acknowledge it. When I'd agreed, when I'd taken that truth and acted on it immediately, I'd broken the unspoken rule of their family, that Chloe's behavior was to be tolerated, enabled, hidden from consequence. My refusal to play along had been the most radical thing I could have done, more powerful than any lawsuit or public exposure. I'd simply chosen to leave, to value myself more than I feared their disapproval. That choice had saved my life in ways both literal and metaphorical, had given me back everything Chloe had systematically taken. The calls from her family had stopped years ago, but the memory of them remained. Dozens of voicemails I'd never listened to, texts I'd deleted unread, emails that had bounced off my block list. They'd wanted me back under control, had been willing to threaten and bribe and manipulate to restore the status quo. But I'd been done, completely and irrevocably, and no amount of pressure could undo a decision I'd made for myself. That was the power they'd never understood. Once someone truly chooses to leave, all the money and social capital and intimidation in the world can't force them to stay. The only power they'd had over me was the power I'd given them by staying, and the moment I'd taken that back, they'd had nothing. I stood at my own wedding years later, Alexis beside me, Ben as my best man, surrounded by friends who'd supported me through everything, and I thought about how different this was from the life I'd been building with Chloe. Real love didn't demand I erase myself. Real partnership didn't require financial destruction to prove commitment. Real family didn't enable abuse and call it loyalty. The people in that room had earned their place through consistency and care, had proven they valued me as a person rather than as a resource. And I'd earned my place too, had proven I could recognize what was broken and have the courage to walk away. The word done had been the beginning of my actual life, the moment I'd stopped performing the role Chloe had assigned me and started being myself again. Her entire family had called me, had tried everything they could to undo that decision. But I'd stayed done. And in doing so, I'd discovered that the best revenge, the truest justice, the most satisfying ending, was simply being happy, being free, being myself without asking permission or apologizing for taking up space. Chloe had tried to make me small enough to control, and I'd chosen to be too big to contain. That was the real story, not the drama or the legal battles or the family campaign. Just one person saying done to abuse and meaning it, completely, permanently, powerfully. And that simple word had been worth every call I'd never answered, every threat I'd endured, every dollar I'd lost. It had been worth everything because it had bought me back myself. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.